All right, so here is my comparison review of the second edition Budo Taijutsu by Duncan Mitchell. If you watched my first video, I did a little unboxing and kind of initial thoughts. I have the first edition, which is this one, and I just recently picked up the second edition. I looked through, and without using any kind of computer software to do like a word-by-word analysis, as I worked my way through this and kind of compared the two, what I found was approximately 99% of the first edition is in the second edition. There's some changes, but they're not really huge. So just to get that out front, if you have the first edition, you don't really need the second edition. There's really not much that's new in this second edition that you don't already have in the first edition. So let me talk a little bit about some of the changes. So there's some minor changes, nothing super major. The first thing is the cover. So this cover here is a glossy cover. The second edition is a matte finish. You'll notice that there's some differences in the way the cover is presented and the like. The second thing that I noticed is the pages. The paper itself seems to be slightly thicker on the second edition than the first edition. Not by a huge amount, but a little bit. Now, I'm not a big paper guy. I don't know all the details about the thicknesses of paper and GSM and all that, but it feels like the second edition is a little thicker. So that would contribute to the reason that it looks bigger. Is if you have thicker paper, it's going to make it bigger. Let me talk a little bit more now about the inside. So the table of contents is different. And I'll talk about the changes to the kind of the overall content. But the table of content is slightly different in the second edition. I'll give you an example here. In the section that deals with the Ryū, right, the schools, you'll notice that Shinden Fudo Ryū, and this is the first edition. In this one, you've got Shinden, you've got Kuki, right? You've got the 6 out of the 9 schools mentioned. But it just gives you the breakdown of each of the major sections. So you've got the Ten no Kata, the Chi no Kata, the Shizen, Shigoku no Kata. Well, in the second edition, what has been changed is now you have not only the breakdown of the major sections of each of the schools, but you also have now each of the kata. So the second edition does make it a little easier for you to find specific kata in the table of contents. Now that means the table of contents is going to take up a few more pages. So that's going to add to the thickness of the second edition as well. So that's kind of one of the more significant changes. And again, they're not really huge changes, but that's one of the changes that you'll find. The other thing that you'll find is there is the removal in the second edition of the acknowledgments. So in the first edition, it had an acknowledgement page. That's been removed in the second edition. Also, at the end, there used to be, in the first edition, there was a small, short bibliography. So here's your bibliography. That's been removed in the second edition. So there is no bibliography. Now, the acknowledgement, well, I could take or leave that, but I would have liked to have the bibliography. So I'm not sure why Mr. Mitchell took that out, but that's been removed. There's also, I noticed, a couple of the images have been removed from the Ryū section. So there's still 2 images, here's one of them, in the Ryū section of the second edition. The first edition, I believe it had 4 little of those images. So you had one, well, that's one right there. So you had this image, and then you had one of Fudoza, I believe it is. 2 of those images have been removed in the second edition. The second edition adds a little note here under our legacy about the fact that Hatsumi Sensei retired from active training in 2020 at the age of 88, it says. Otherwise, this section is the same as the first edition, so that's a change. The only other real significant change, I would say, is the first edition only contained 2 major sections. So you had part 1, Foundations, and then you had part 2, and this was Keiko Gata, practice forms. In the second edition, there's actually 3 parts. There's part 1, Foundations of Budo, and then there is part 2, which is the Kihon Gata, and then there's part 3, which is the Keiko Gata. But there's no difference in the content. All that's happened is the author has taken the Kihon, which in the first edition was under part 2, Keiko Gata. You had the Kihon. Well, he's just separated that out and made it its own section. So you got part 2 is the Kihon Gata, and then part 3. But it's the same information. He's just moved it. And that really is the bulk of any of the changes that are in here. It's all pretty much identical. I didn't go word for word, but I did spot check a number of the descriptions and things like that. And I tried to look at obviously the table of contents, and I looked at some various photos or these little images. And really, there's just been a shifting of some of the material from one area to a different area. I'll give you an example. So I've already given you an example with the Kihon, but I'll give you an example here. So you have, in the first edition, you had Shinden Fudo Ryū, then Kuki Shinden, Takagi, Gyokko Ryū, Koto Ryū, and then Takagi Yoshin, Togakure Ryū. In the second edition, you have Shinden, and then you have Gyokko Ryū, Koto Ryū, and then it switches to Togakure Ryū, and then Kuki Shinden Ryū, and then Takagi Yoshin Ryū. So you can see that the schools just have been shifted around. So he's changed the order. But that really is the bulk of any kind of changes. So unless somebody else has gone through word for word in these 2, like I said, I did a pretty good comparison. I really can't find much that's different. Like I said, probably 99% of the first edition is the second edition. There's just some minor tweaks, some little changes. There's a couple changes to the way the titles look a little bit, but again, nothing major. So if you already have the first edition, I don't think there's any need for you to get the second unless your first copy is, tattered and falling apart, or you're like me and you just like collecting books on Budo and Ninpo and the like. So if you don't have the first edition, though, highly, highly, highly recommend that you get the second edition. It is well worth the money. It's very reasonable cost. So get yourself the second edition if you don't already have it. If you already have the first edition, I don't think that you really need the second. That does remind me really quickly. I will mention one other thing that is different in the second edition, and that is the addition of some footnotes. So the first edition didn't have footnotes. The second edition has some footnotes. Some pages have more than others, but there's some footnotes. But really, I don't think the footnotes make it an absolute necessity. Again, if you've already got the first edition to get the second. I mean, if you want the footnotes, go ahead. But that really is all that I've been able to find. So let me wrap it up here. This video is going probably longer than it should have. I really like this book, whether it's the first or the second edition. I really think you need to get a copy of it if you don't already have it. If you have the first edition, my view is you don't need the second. Hopefully that's been helpful.